Thank you very much. So yes, today is, oddly enough, my favorite topic, complaints, which isn't a favorite topic for most people. I mean, most of us, hands up, has anybody ever sent a complaint to an organization? Wow, yeah. A couple of people haven't. You need to get your pen sharpened up. So, and has anyone ever received a complaint? Anyone received a complaint yet? Yeah. So complaining is just something we do, okay? Humans do. We complain a lot in all sorts of spheres of life. But there's something particular about the written complaint, where somebody puts pen to paper or keyboard, they engage their computer, and they've had an experience with an organization, and what they want to do is, it's not been a good experience, and they want to tell the organization about that experience. Why do they want to tell the organization about that experience? There's many reasons. Maybe they want compensation. Maybe they're frustrated. Maybe they just want the problem to be solved. A lot of complaints are not about compensation or getting people into trouble. They're acts of citizenship where people are trying to tell an organization something they think the organization doesn't know. That's why they're writing the complaint. And the work we've done in LSE with Professor Alex Gillespie in the department has been looking for over 10 years now. We've been reading complaints from all sorts of places, hospitals, police forces, airlines, in the judicial sector, finance, complaints in all sorts of domains. And what we're really interested in is a couple of things. One is the insight that is held within a complaint. When people write to an organization to tell the organization something, what is it that they're trying to tell, and what is the value of the insight? And the second, and this is really what today's talk is about, is how can organizations draw that insight out? How can they learn from complaints? And it's really difficult to learn from complaints. And the reason it's really difficult to learn from complaints is sometimes it's culturally difficult for an organization to learn. They just don't listen. But there's also a sort of data problem with learning from complaints, which is the more complaints you get, the more and more data you have. Lots of written stories about you. How do you take all those together and aggregate them? And that's what our work has been doing, primarily in the field of healthcare. Sorry, I'm just going to... The reason we're interested in healthcare is because of the information that's on the slide. I've been working so we've been working on this for about over 10 years now. I'm very interested in the topic of patient safety and medical error, which is where I started my career, actually, looking at how can we reduce harm in hospitals. So for context, around 10% of patients experience what's called an adverse event. So this is a mistake during the process of their care. That could be a misdiagnosis, it could be a wrong medication, it could be something small, just a sort of bandage put on incorrectly, all the way to things like instruments left in people's bodies, wrong site surgery, hospital-acquired infections, no anesthetic, all sorts of things. And you can see there that the NHS spends around £15 billion a year, that's from last year, treating, compensating and doing back the damage caused by medical errors. So around 10% of patients experience a medical error, around a quarter of them are preventable. There's around 11,000 deaths every year in the NHS caused by medical error. That's roughly 50 Boeing 757s, I think, crashing. So there's a lot of people are harmed by medical error. We don't see it because it's so diffuse. It's happening across the system, but it matters a lot. And you get different types of errors. So you get the ones like the picture there, which shows the instrument inside the body, which that does happen. Not as big an instrument as that, but it does happen. You have swabs and things like this left in people's bodies occasionally, all the way to very systemic ones, like Mid Staffordshire, where there was very systemic patient neglect, where people were being not fed, not treated properly. And things like the Bristol Heart Inquiry, where you had an unsafe surgeon operating for many years. What's common across all of these accounts, these case stories, where we've looked into them, is the role of complaints. Is that the hospitals where they experience problems in safety, where unsafe care is going on, patients and families complain about it. They're often writing letters of complaint to the hospital about what's going on for many years sometimes, but nobody is listening, or no one's responding to it. And inside of this work, we've hit across a paradox. And the paradox is the following. When an organization has become unsafe, so when people have normalized risk-taking, when they don't see risk anymore, how can they fix it? And this is what the patient safety research finds. It's why patient safety doesn't improve that much. So in a hospital that's become unsafe, people can't speak up. They don't report mistakes anymore, meaning that the mistakes aren't dealt with. And so they have this paradox, which is the problems in unsafe care are caused by the culture, but the culture is also stopping those problems being remedied because you can't see them anymore. And this is where we turn to the topic of complaints, which is perhaps you can't expect an organization just to self-correct its problems. Perhaps sometimes they need external feedback from the people that engage the organization. And this is where we come to complaints in the NHS. So just for context, this is for 23-24, there were nearly 250,000 complaints sent by patients and families to NHS, and this includes community services, GPs, and the like. So even to put that into further context, that's 250 million words. Like, that is a lot of feedback. I know it's funny because the NHS is often trying to engage patients and families on can you give us feedback, but actually people do this all the time. And what's happening is they're experiencing problems in their healthcare. They go home or not, their families go home, and they try to tell the NHS, their hospital, whoever it is, about the problems they experienced. And what we're interested in is how can you take this data and learn from it? So the NHS organizations we've dealt with, they're pretty good at dealing, or they can be okay at dealing with one-on-one complaints. You had a complaint about a misdiagnosis, they will try to get to the bottom of it possibly. But what they're not very good at is taking all of the complaints together and saying, what does this reveal about us? What does it tell us about the problems that are going on? And why are complaints? Why do we go to complaints? Well, we go to complaints for the following reason. I was talking earlier on about how when a culture becomes problematic, you can't correct it. It's sort of the culture can't correct the culture. Patients and families sit outside of the organization. They aren't affected by the culture. They have an independence. And that independence means they see the organization as it is, and they report on it as it is. And they can't be silenced that easily either. Around 1/3 of patient-family complaints report on safety problems. So our thesis is that, well, if you can draw out the insight from the complaints, you can improve safety. And we've done, a decade of research on this. Just some of the highlights from the research. We've developed something called the Healthcare Complaints Analysis Tool. So this is the first tool for systematically codifying. An average complaint's about 1,000 words. So for codifying what's in a complaint, the types of problems and how severe they are. We find that those complaints reveal what we call hotspots and blind spots. So they show where you're having a sudden growth of problems, like perhaps it's maternity care, but also blind spots, problems that an organization doesn't know it has. What does that look like? Well, it might look like communication. Tests going from one place, not being received by another. Often organizations don't know when the person sending doesn't know if the receiver's got it, and the receiver doesn't know it was ever sent. How do you know that's happening? Well, the patient knows because they never get a follow-up, and so they write a complaint to talk about that. Or perhaps their drugs were incorrect, and they had an adverse reaction after they left hospital. Only they know that. And you get this across all organizations. The outsider who's engaging with the service, they see blind spots. So the idea is that they can see these hot spots and blind spots. We find that these predict mortality, which is kind of incredible, because lots of internal hospital data doesn't. Where you track and score complaints across an entire healthcare system like the NHS, you can predict future outcomes for patients on the basis of the severity of problems being reported. The worse the problems, the worse the outcomes. And that's not just because the problems being reported are shaping the outcomes, it's because they reveal something about the culture of those institutions. They tell the whole story. So we found sometimes that when staff report on medical errors, when you look at a complaint, it can provide a much bigger picture. So staff can even blame themselves for a medical error. I gave the wrong drug and it had an adverse reaction. And the patient will say, well, it doesn't say in the notes that I had an allergic response to this. So actually they will see a much bigger view of things going wrong. And our work has gone into areas like online feedback. So we now study not just complaints. So when I talk about complaints, I'm talking about we've collected from hospitals written complaints sent to them, and they've shared them with us. But we also look at online complaints where people go into the online realm to complain. And this is really interesting because here it's someone encountered a problem in a hospital that wasn't dealt with. They wrote a complaint about it that wasn't responded to. So they then go into the online realm to say, look, someone needs to do, they were kind of whistleblowing. And so we find that here, complaints in the online world almost act like a safety valve, we call it. They tell you when an organization has a bit lost control. The complaint handlers bind. This is also quite interesting. We look at how complaints respond to how organizations respond to complaints. And we find sometimes that they can't, that the people who are in charge of responding to complaints aren't able to address them because they don't have the power to. They have to look like they're responding to them while simultaneously not responding to them because they can't deal with the problems. So the appointment system's messed up in the organization. They have to somehow sympathize, say, I'm really sorry about that, and we'll try and fix that, but they can't deal with the appointment system. So again, it tells you something about the organization. And perhaps just lastly, what do we see complaints doing overall? Where an organization is getting a lot of complaints and they're high severity, it tells you, we say problems and dealing with problems. It tells you where the organization has a culture of not being very good at dealing with problems. And the complaints reveal this, and they tell you about it. So they're a very powerful data source. And they are impactful. So our work, particularly the healthcare complaints analysis tool, it's used by healthcare organizations in at least 14 countries around the world to analyze and codify complaints. So it's free to use. It's a manual coding system. But we've sort of hit a ceiling on it, which is really the rest of the talk, which is there's a data problem inside of all this. And that is, if you're, well, hopefully the LSE complaints department doesn't look like this, but organizational departments are a bit like this, although in digital. They have lots and lots of complaints, and they're growing. 250,000 complaints to the NHS last year. It'll be 250,000 this year. We calculated it would take one person 90,000 hours to read all of those complaints. Okay, that's 3,000 novels. How on earth can you do this reliably? And how could anyone even read this? And by the time you've read them, you've got another 250,000 that will have come in. And how do you ever put this into any kind of system improvement? And although our tool is good at diagnosing the problems in a qualitative sense, it just cannot scale upwards in this way. And so this is why organizations, particularly the NHS, but also many other organizations that we've worked with, they struggle to learn from complaints. It's not just cultural, it's actually data. It's just too much. How can you deal with all of these experiences coming into you, being sent to you? And this is where we're working. The current work we're doing is looking at AI as the solution. And some of it's been done and some of it's going on. Which is, if you just think in the last 10 years what's happened with AI, whether that is with natural language processing, so that's computer algorithms that read text and extract insight from it and that you can use to measure text, and large language models like ChatGPT and other ones which can just read text. This is game-changing for the field of complaints. All of a sudden, you can now get a computer to read the complaints. Now, I'm not suggesting you get rid of people who read complaints and respond to complaints or anything like this, but this is a huge development because what would have taken 90,000 hours to read can now be truncated into a tiny amount of time. It needs a lot of computing power. But that's what we're interested in. That's what we're doing right now. We're looking at whether you can develop AI algorithms that can read the complaints and draw insight from them. And extract. And just kind of give you a couple of examples of the types of things you might do. What are we talking about? So it might be that we develop algorithms, sort of classic natural language processing algorithms that look for types of problems and their severity. So we're interested in medication errors. So we have 250,000 complaints. We look across them of reports on medication errors. We develop an algorithm to look at those and look at how bad they are. That's incredible. Now all of a sudden, you can, through analyzing all of these complaints, get a track on how many patients are reporting medication errors in their care journey. You can do other things. You can think about using it to measure the culture. So you might be thinking, well, okay, that's a concept. We're looking at a type of problem. We're interested in a higher level, perhaps people not listening. So people being dismissed, which is something we look at. People reporting, going into hospitals, saying I had a problem, and they've been dismissed. we can develop algorithms to do that as well. That's a little bit different. That's a bit like running a Google search on all of the complaints and saying, out of all the sentences in these complaints, score and find those which are about people being dismissed. And then you have even another level of analysis where maybe you're using things like large language models to analyze on a more bottom-up sense of what are the types of issues being reported, but also learning. So how does an organization respond to complaints? How is it changing? Do complaints change year on year in content? And here you can use things like large language models. And so the dream, and this is a sort of part research, but there's also a commercial side to this, is to develop what we call HCAT AI. So that's the Healthcare Complaints Analysis Tool AI. And kind of what we're imagining is something along the lines of the following. You have all of these complaints coming into hospitals and the healthcare system. You have a validated set of algorithms, like the ones we've been talking about, that predict mortality and the likes, that codify all these complaints, and they do two things. They score them quantitatively, so how many problems, how bad, where are they, and qualitatively. So this is the really interesting thing about textual data, is you can put a number on it, but you can always go back to the qualitative statement about the number. So when we say, okay, what are the medication errors, you can actually go back to the text to show all those medication errors, the context that they happened in, how people described them, what the medication was, which is kind of incredible. You can go back to the source text. So the idea is that you have these complaints being patient and family complaints coming into hospital, the algorithm reads them, and they basically go two places. The first place they go to is a complaint handler. So the algorithm helps the complaint handler to read the complaint and disentangle it and to understand what's in it. This makes it a much more reliable process. Instead of people just reading them and coding them themselves, they're being helped by the computer to read them. And then at the level of management, you have top-level insights coming to them, where, for example, the severity of complaints being raised in your hospital, you have this being tracked. And just to kind of illustrate, I know it's a little bit small, but you can imagine here it says complaint text. After my surgery, I told staff multiple times that pain relief wasn't working. Turned out I'd been given the wrong medication entirely. When I tried to explain how much pain I was in, I was told to give it time. And we're imagining an interface that breaks down the complaint severity, says that's a high severity complaint, the doctor administered a pain, wrong medication, there was physical harm, there was emotional harm. And so we're imagining at the one level, the complaint handler, the algorithms are helping them to read the complaint and get to the bottom of the issue. But then this data, that's on the ground, that's people in hospitals reading complaints, trying to respond quickly to them. And then at the other level, which I know is tiny, but it's just you can see the graphs, you're having like graphs showing you, okay, here's the severity of the complaint in your hospital. Is it going up or down? Here's the spread, the year-on-year analysis. And what I can't show there, but it shows a little bit, is within that data, you can always zoom into the text, is the idea. So you know how normally when you get a bar chart, whatever that is, you can't zoom in to see what's underneath it. You know, it's about your organization or whatever it is, and it's just a survey item. You don't know what people were thinking. The thing here is that you'll be able to zoom in to the textual data underneath the graphs. So it will score the type of complaint, the severity, all of these issues, and then the hospitals will be able to zoom in to the textual data underneath. So that's that's what we're working on. So we've had this project on complaints, drawing out the insights of patients and families. And what this is trying to do ultimately, I suppose, is recognize that in those 250,000 complaints in the NHS, and of course many healthcare systems get complaints, it's trying to find a way of, through AI algorithms, good and insight, to draw the communication, in a way to listen to the voices of patients and families, but to have listening at an organizational level. I think organizations can be good at listening at the individual level. It's often at the organizational level they struggle. And this is what we think AI has changed the game on, because ultimately complaints are textual data, and the one thing it's amazing at is analyzing textual data. And that's pretty much it for now. There's some references there if people are interested to do any follow-up reading. I'll just lastly say, although we see this as relating to healthcare, and that's where we have a lot of expertise, actually we're finding this is proving very relevant for lots of different domains. One of our PhD students, Hannah Bunt, is looking at this in the domain of finance. We've been looking at this in justice in lots of sectors. So there is something very universal about, one, the complaint, as a way of people trying to communicate something to organizations, but two, the idea that we can draw insight for organizations from those complaints. Thank you very much.